She was forced to marry the feared mountain man as debt payment. But what he did next stunned the entire valley. In a saloon thick with smoke and shame, a desperate father trades his daughter's hand to settle his sins. Everyone whispers that the mountain man will break her. But when he steps from the shadows, scarred and silent, he does something no one expects. He bows his head and asks for a preacher, not a price. Up in the snow-choked hills, this so-called beast builds her a fire, not a cage. Yet whispers follow them, rumors of a dark past, of a secret the railroad men would kill to bury. When greed sets the valley ablaze and chains rattle once more, her courage becomes his only salvation. Now, in a land where mercy is rare as spring rain, can a woman bought in shame and a man feared in silence teach a broken town what grace really means? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. In the flickering lamplight of the Bitterroot Saloon, the clink of glasses and murmur of voices filled the smoky air. Samuel Finch's trembling hands clutched his last coin, his weathered face etched with desperation. The rough-hewn wooden table before him held scattered cards and broken dreams. His bleary eyes could barely focus on the game that would seal his fate. Latham Pike's gold tooth gleamed as he laid down his cards with a flourish. "Full house, Samuel. Looks like your luck's run dry." His voice dripped with false sympathy, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. Samuel's shoulders slumped as the coin was swept away. The familiar burn of cheap whiskey couldn't dull the crushing weight of his failure. Around him, other card players shifted uncomfortably, knowing what came next. The evening air grew thick with tension. "Time to settle accounts, schoolmaster," Pike drawled, producing a leather-bound ledger. The numbers written there told a story of months of losing hands and borrowed money. "By my count, you're in for more than $300. Samuel's face went ash-white. I can pay. Just need more time." "Time's up," Pike cut him off, gesturing to two burly men who emerged from the shadows. "Either pay now, or we'll let the sheriff sort it out. Reckon the territorial prison could use another educated man?" The threat of jail hung heavy in the air. Samuel's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The other patrons turned away, embarrassed to witness a man's dignity crumbling before their eyes. Pike leaned back in his chair, a calculated gleam in his eye. Of course, there might be another way to clear the debt. He paused, savoring the moment. "That daughter of yours, Gianna. Pretty thing, ain't she? Proper educated, too." Samuel's head snapped up, horror dawning on his face. "Leave her out of this." "Word is, Daniel Red's been looking for a wife," Pike continued, ignoring Samuel's protest. "Man lives alone up in those mountains, trapping and trading. Some say he's half Apache. Others say he's killed men. But he's got means, and he pays his debts." Pike's smile widened. "A bride payment would cover what you owe, with interest." The saloon had gone quiet, every ear straining to catch the conversation. Samuel's face contorted with shame and desperation. Outside, through the grimy window, Gianna Finch could be seen walking past, carrying her teaching materials from the day's lessons. "Call her in," Pike commanded, already pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "Let's make this official-like." One of Pike's men stepped outside. Moments later, Gianna entered the saloon, confusion evident on her face. She clutched her books to her chest, looking small and out of place among the rough crowd. Her simple blue dress and neat brown hair spoke of modest dignity, a stark contrast to the tawdry surroundings. "Papa?" Her voice wavered as she took in her father's defeated posture. "What's happening?" Before Samuel could answer, Pike spoke up. "Your father's in a bind, Miss Finch, but we've found a solution that benefits everyone." He gestured to the paper before him. "A marriage contract." Gianna's face paled. "Marriage? I don't understand." "To Daniel Red," Pike announced, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. Murmurs and cruel chuckles rippled through the crowd. "The bear man of Bitterroot Valley?" Gianna's books slipped from her grasp, thudding against the wooden floor. Her eyes darted to her father, silently pleading for him to deny it. But Samuel couldn't meet her gaze, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Papa, no," she whispered, but the words were lost in the growing laughter of the onlookers. Just then, the saloon's batwing doors creaked open. The laughter died instantly as Daniel Red ducked his head to enter. At 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over everyone present. His buckskin jacket bore the wear of mountain living, and a long rifle was slung across his broad back. A scar ran down the left side of his face, disappearing into his dark beard. His features spoke of his mixed heritage, high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that held both wisdom and wariness. The silence was absolute as Daniel surveyed the scene. His gaze moved from Pike's smirking face to Samuel's broken form, finally settling on Gianna. Something flickered in his eyes, not the predatory look the crowd expected, but something deeper, sadder. Without a word, Daniel unslung his rifle and laid it carefully on a nearby table. The gesture, deliberate and dignified, confused the onlookers who'd expected violence. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried throughout the room. "If the lady is to be my wife," he said, each word measured and clear, "it will be proper and lawful before God and man." His accent held a hint of the frontier, but his speech was educated. No bride payment, no debt trading. He turned to face Pike directly. A real marriage with witnesses, and a preacher. Pike's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated. The cruel entertainment he'd planned was being transformed into something else entirely. Gianna stood frozen, her eyes fixed on Daniel. His calm demeanor and unexpected words had thrown her world even further off balance. She'd heard stories of the mysterious mountain man, tales of violence and savagery that now seemed at odds with the dignified figure before her. "The debt must still be settled," Pike insisted, trying to regain control of the situation. "I will pay it," Daniel replied simply. "In full, but not as part of any marriage arrangement." He turned to address Gianna directly, his voice softening. "Miss Finch, I offer marriage as an honorable proposal, not a business transaction. You may accept or refuse of your own free will." The saloon erupted in confused whispers. This wasn't how such things were supposed to go. Pike's face darkened with frustration as his carefully orchestrated humiliation began to unravel. Samuel Finch finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he choked out, looking at his daughter. "I'm so sorry, Gianna." Gianna felt the weight of every eye in the room. Her world had shattered and reformed in the space of minutes. The shame of her father's gambling, the threat of debtor's prison, the cruel manipulation of Pike, and now this unexpected turn from Daniel Red. It all swirled around her like a dust devil on the prairie. Daniel stood quietly, making no move to pressure or rush her decision. His stillness seemed to create a pocket of calm in the chaos of the moment. Despite his imposing size and fearsome reputation, there was something in his manner that spoke of deep respect. For her, for the sanctity of marriage, for the gravity of the choice before them. The lamplight continued to flicker, casting moving shadows on the rough walls of the Bitterroot saloon. In that moment, time seemed suspended between heartbeats, between breaths, between the world that was and the world that would be. "I'll fetch the preacher," someone in the crowd offered, breaking the spell. Pike slammed his hand on the table. "Now see here." "The debt will be paid tonight," Daniel interrupted firmly. "In cash, but the marriage, if it happens, will be done right." His tone left no room for argument. Gianna finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly. I need a moment to think." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Take what time you need, Miss Finch." He moved a step away, but then added quietly, "Know that whatever you decide, your father's debt will still be settled. You need not choose marriage to save him." This final statement, spoken so simply, caused fresh tears to spring to Samuel's eyes. It was perhaps the first truly honorable thing he'd witnessed in months of darkness and degradation. The crowd in the saloon waited, caught between disappointment at losing their entertainment and fascination with this unexpected turn of events. The cruel jokes and laughter had died away, replaced by something approaching respect for the dignity Daniel had brought to an ugly situation. Through the windows, the sun was setting over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Inside the saloon, in the growing darkness, a young woman stood at a crossroads, facing a choice that would reshape not just her future, but the very nature of how such stories unfold in the wild heart of the frontier. The moon hung like a pale lantern in the winter sky as Gianna and Daniel left the Bitterroot saloon behind them. The night air bit sharp and clean after the stuffy warmth inside. Their breaths formed small clouds in the darkness as they walked toward where Daniel had left his horses. Daniel kept a respectful distance, his boots crunching in the frozen dirt beside her, but never closing the gap between them. When Gianna stumbled once on the uneven ground, his hand moved instinctively to steady her, but stopped short, returning to his side without making contact. Two horses waited in the shadows, Daniel's sturdy mountain stallion and a gentle-looking mare he'd purchased from the livery stable. He'd insisted on buying her a proper mount, rather than having her ride double, another gesture that spoke of his careful consideration. "Can you mount on your own, Miss Finch?" His voice was soft in the darkness. Gianna nodded, grateful she'd learned to ride as a girl. The mare stood patient and calm as she gathered her skirts and pulled herself into the saddle. Daniel checked her stirrups without touching her feet, then mounted his own horse with fluid grace that belied his size. They rode in silence through the sleeping town, past darkened windows and empty streets. The clip-clop of hooves on packed earth seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Gianna's mind whirled with the evening's events, but she couldn't find words to break the heavy silence between them. The road toward Reverend Cutter's cabin wound through stands of pine and aspen. Moonlight filtered through bare branches, casting dappled shadows on the snow. The cold grew sharper as they climbed, and Gianna pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. Daniel noticed her shiver. Without a word, he reined in his horse and dismounted. From his saddlebag, he pulled a thick buffalo robe and offered it up to her, still maintaining that careful distance that allowed her to take it without their fingers brushing. "Thank you," Gianna murmured, wrapping the warm hide around herself. The robe carried the scent of wood smoke and pine needles. They rode on as the night deepened. Occasionally, an owl's cry would pierce the silence, or a branch would crack under the weight of snow. Daniel led them surely through the darkness, clearly familiar with every turn of the trail. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn when they finally approached the Reverend's cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, suggesting someone was already awake despite the early hour. Daniel dismounted first and approached the cabin door. His knock, though gentle, seemed to echo in the pre-dawn stillness. After a moment, lamplight flickered behind the curtained window. Reverend Josiah Cutter opened the door, blinking in surprise at his early visitors. He was still in his nightshirt, with a hastily donned coat over it. "Daniel read?" The preacher's voice held a note of uncertainty. "What brings you here at this hour?" "We've come to be married, Reverend," Daniel said simply. "If you're willing." The preacher's eyes widened as he noticed Gianna still mounted on her horse. His gaze darted between them, confusion and concern evident on his face. This is rather irregular. Perhaps we should discuss." Daniel reached into his coat and produced the signed debt note from Pike's saloon. "Everything's proper and settled," he said quietly. "We'd just like the ceremony done right, with scripture read as it should be." Martha Cutter appeared behind her husband, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes took in the scene with quiet understanding. "Come inside, dear," she called to Gianna. "You must be frozen through. Let me fix you some tea while the men talk." Daniel helped Gianna dismount, still without touching her, then led the horses to the small stable beside the cabin. Inside, Martha stirred up the fire in the cook stove, while Reverend Cutter read through the papers Daniel had brought. "Everything appears to be in order," the preacher said finally, though his voice still held doubt. "But are you both certain about this? Marriage is a sacred covenant before God." "I understand that well, Reverend," Daniel replied. His voice was respectful but firm. "That's why we're here at your door instead of finding a judge in town." Gianna sat at the Cutter's kitchen table, warming her hands around a cup of Martha's strong tea. The older woman had pulled a chair close beside her, her presence comforting without being intrusive. "Would you like a moment to freshen up, dear?" Martha asked gently. "I have a clean brush and some water heated." Gianna nodded gratefully. In Martha's small bedroom, she smoothed her travel-worn dress and ran a brush through her hair. Her reflection in the small mirror looked pale but composed. She touched the silver cross at her throat, her mother's last gift, and drew strength from its familiar presence. When she returned to the main room, Daniel had laid out 2 rings on the Reverend's Bible. One was a simple band of gold, likely purchased in town before their departure. The other was carved from pine wood, smoothed and polished to a warm glow. The careful craftsmanship spoke of hours of patient work. "I made it," Daniel said quietly, noticing her gaze on the wooden ring. "Wasn't sure if it would be wanted, but it seemed right to have both options." Reverend Cutter cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" They stood before the fireplace, its warmth at their backs as dawn's first light began to filter through the windows. The preacher opened his Bible, its well-worn pages familiar under his fingers. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice growing stronger as he fell into the familiar rhythm of the ceremony. "We are gathered here in the sight of God." Gianna's hands trembled as she repeated her vows, but her voice remained steady. Daniel's deep voice was clear and sure as he made his promises, though his eyes held a hint of something like wonder when she chose the wooden ring he had carved. When the ceremony was complete, Daniel turned to her with grave courtesy. "You're free to choose where you'll go from here," he said softly. "But I offer you a safe roof until spring thaw, if you wish it. No obligations beyond that." Before Gianna could respond, Martha spoke up. "You'll both stay for breakfast first. No arguing. The snow's picking up again, and you'll need hot food in you before any more riding." Daniel nodded his thanks and stepped outside to tend to the horses. Through the window, Gianna watched as he moved through the swirling snow. A scraggly dog had appeared from somewhere in the trees, and Daniel paused in his work. From his pocket, he pulled what looked like dried meat, offering it to the nervous creature with infinite patience. "That man's no beast," Martha whispered, coming to stand beside Gianna at the window. "Whatever tales you might have heard." Gianna watched as Daniel knelt in the snow, allowing the stray dog to inch closer at its own pace. His huge hands, capable of such strength, were gentle as they offered food to the frightened animal. The morning light caught in his dark hair, dusted now with snow, and for a moment he looked almost like a figure from a fairy tale. Not the monster of frontier rumors, but something else entirely. "No," Gianna agreed softly. "I'm beginning to see that." Martha squeezed her shoulder gently. "Come help me with these biscuits, dear. Your husband will be hungry when he comes in from the cold." The word husband caught in Gianna's chest like a strange new thing. She turned from the window and followed Martha to the stove, where the older woman was already cutting flour into fat with practiced hands. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, a morning bird began to sing. Through the window, she could still see Daniel, now surrounded by several more dogs that had emerged from the trees. He stood in the snowlight, sharing his breakfast with the strays, his face peaceful in the growing dawn. The scene struck her heart with unexpected force. This feared bear man showing such simple kindness when he thought no one was watching. Martha hummed an old hymn as she worked, her movements sure and comfortable in the familiar kitchen. The smell of coffee and wood smoke filled the air, and the fire crackled in the stove. It was a morning like any other in the Cutter's cabin, yet for Gianna everything had changed. Reverend Cutter sat at his desk, carefully recording their marriage in his church registry. His earlier hesitation seemed to have faded, replaced by thoughtful consideration as he watched Daniel through the window. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Sometimes he sends us what we need, not what we expect." The morning light grew stronger, turning the falling snow to silver. Inside the warm cabin, Gianna helped Martha prepare breakfast, her new wooden ring smooth against her finger. Outside, Daniel continued his quiet act of kindness, unaware of being observed. The day was just beginning, full of uncertainty, but somehow the simple scene before her gave Gianna a courage she hadn't expected to find. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cutter's humble cabin as they finished their breakfast prayers. Reverend Cutter's voice carried the final Amen with quiet dignity, and Martha began clearing away the dishes with practiced efficiency. Daniel rose from the table first. "We should get started," he said softly. "Storm's coming in from the north." Gianna watched through the window as he headed to the stable. The morning light caught the frost on his broad shoulders, and she noticed how he moved with deliberate care, as if always mindful of his size and strength. Martha pressed a wrapped bundle into Gianna's hands. "Some bread and dried meat for the journey," she explained, her eyes kind, "and an extra quilt. You'll need it in this weather." "Thank you," Gianna whispered, touched by the older woman's thoughtfulness. "For everything." "God be with you both," Reverend Cutter said, standing in the doorway as Gianna stepped outside. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow. Daniel had already saddled both horses, checking each strap with meticulous attention. He'd loaded their supplies carefully, distributing the weight evenly. When Gianna approached, he helped her mount without touching more than necessary, his movements precise and respectful. They set out as the sun climbed higher, leaving the Cutter's cabin behind. The trail wound north through Bitterroot Pass, where bare trees stood like sentinels against the pale sky. Daniel rode slightly ahead, his broad back a shield against the strengthening wind. His rifle lay across his saddle, ready but not threatening. After an hour of silence, broken only by their horses' steady breathing and the crunch of hooves on frozen ground, Daniel spoke. "Cabin's 2 days' ride up Cold Creek Ridge," he said, voice carrying just enough to reach her. "Trail gets steep in places, but the horses know the way." Gianna nodded, though he couldn't see it. She studied his back, noting how he sat easily in the saddle despite the cold. His dark hair, touched with silver at the temples, was tied back with a leather cord. Everything about him spoke of capability and control. The morning wore on as they climbed higher into the pass. Storm, clouds gathered overhead, heavy with the promise of snow. Daniel kept them moving at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling. When they stopped to rest the horses at midday, he brought Gianna a cup of coffee from his saddlebag, made earlier at the Cutters. "Still warm," he said simply, keeping his distance as she took it. The hot liquid helped chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. She watched as Daniel checked the horse's legs and hooves, his big hands gentle on their fetlocks. He spoke softly to each animal in turn, his voice a low rumble of comfort. They continued on as afternoon shadows lengthened across the trail. The wind picked up, carrying the first few snowflakes. Daniel led them to a sheltered spot near a frozen stream, just as dusk began to fall. "We'll camp here," he announced, dismounting smoothly. "Good water under the ice, and the trees will break the wind." While Gianna stretched her stiff legs, Daniel efficiently set up camp. He built a lean-to against a large boulder, positioning it to block the worst of the weather. The structure was simple but sturdy, woven from pine boughs and secured with practiced skill. A fire bloomed under his careful hands, and soon the smell of coffee mixed with warming stew filled their small camp. Daniel served her first, then took his own portion and sat on the other side of the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the old scar that ran along his jaw. "You should take the lean-to," he said as they finished eating. "I've got my blanket roll for out here." "But surely," Gianna began to protest. "Please," he said quietly. "It's proper this way." He handed her his own heavy blanket, in addition to the one Martha had provided. The wool still carried his scent, pine smoke and leather. Gianna settled into the lean-to, surprised to find it relatively warm, with the fire reflected off the rock face behind. Through the branches, she watched as Daniel banked the fire for the night. He moved with the same careful precision she'd observed all day, each action measured and purposeful. When he finally settled on his blanket roll, he lay with his back to the fire, facing outward into the darkness like a sentinel. The night deepened. Wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Gianna lay awake, listening to the strange music of the wilderness. Despite her fears, she felt oddly secure, knowing Daniel kept watch just beyond the firelight. Dawn came with a pearl-gray light filtering through the trees. Gianna woke to the sound of soft humming, a hymn she recognized from Sunday services. The melody drifted through the morning air, clear and true. She peered out from the lean-to find Daniel already up, tending the rekindled fire. His deep voice carried the familiar tune without embellishment, honest as a prayer. When he noticed her stirring, the song faded away, but its echo lingered in the morning stillness. They broke camp, efficiently, Daniel taking care of the horses while Gianna packed away their supplies. The day stretched ahead as they continued their journey, climbing higher into Cold Creek Ridge. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world draped in fresh snow that sparkled under a clear sky. By late afternoon of the second day, Daniel led them around a final bend in the trail. There, nestled against the mountainside, stood his cabin. Smoke rose straight and true from its stone chimney, and a neat woodpile lined one wall. A small barn stood nearby, its door secured against the weather. "Home," Daniel said simply, helping Gianna dismount. The cabin proved as orderly inside as out. Clean windows let in the fading light, illuminating a space that spoke of careful craftsmanship. A solid table stood in the center, its surface smooth from years of use. Shelves lined one wall, holding provisions and a few books. A cast-iron stove gleamed in one corner, ready for cooking. What caught Gianna's eye, however, was the Bible placed carefully on the table, its leather cover well worn but cared for. A bookmark made from a dried pine needle marked a page in Psalms. Daniel moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, storing their supplies and building up the fire. Everything had its place, she noticed. Each tool hung precisely, each cup and plate stacked with purpose. This was not the lair of a wild man, but the home of someone who lived by choice and principle. "You can have the bed," he said, gesturing to the narrow cot in the corner. "I'll sleep by the fire." He paused, then added softly, "I meant what I said at the preacher's. You're free to choose your path when spring comes. Until then, you'll be safe here." Gianna looked around the cabin again, seeing it with new eyes. The dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the carefully mended curtain in the window, the stack of split kindling by the stove. Each detail revealed something about the man who had built this place. Whatever stories the town told about the fearsome bear man, the truth stood before her in simple, sturdy reality. Daniel moved towards the door. "Need to see to the horses," he said. "Make yourself at home." The words could have been mere courtesy, but his tone carried genuine sincerity. Through the window, Gianna watched him cross to the barn, his footprints marking a straight line in the new snow. The setting sun painted the mountain in shades of rose and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out its evening song. She found herself touching the wooden ring on her finger, feeling its smooth grain, thinking of the patient hands that had carved it. The cabin settled around her with quiet welcome as darkness fell. A kettle bubbled on the stove, and the fire cast warm light across the swept floor. On the table, the Bible waited like a bridge between two worlds, his and hers, past and future, fear and understanding. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she had shelter, safety, and the growing certainty that Daniel read was a man who lived by something deeper than impulse or reputation. The cabin's warmth wrapped around Gianna like a blanket as Daniel moved about the kitchen area. His broad shoulders seemed too large for the space, yet he navigated with careful grace between stove and shelves. A pot of venison stew simmered, filling the air with rich aromas of sage and wild onions. Daniel kept his eyes lowered as he worked, measuring cornmeal into a wooden bowl for bannock bread. His movements were precise but hesitant, as if unsure how to cook with someone watching. A light dusting of flour whitened his scarred knuckles as he worked the dough. "Can I help?" Gianna offered, trying to break the heavy silence. He shook his head. "Rest. Journey was long." His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. She settled onto a rough-hewn bench, watching as he shaped the bannock into flat circles and laid them on the hot stones near the fire. The familiar domestic scene struck her as strange, this feared bear man, fussing over bread like any farm wife. His huge hands moved with surprising delicacy as he turned the bannock to brown evenly. The stew bubbled, and Daniel stirred it carefully before ladling generous portions into 2 tin bowls. He served Gianna first, setting the bowl before her with fresh bannock on a wooden plate. Steam rose in the cooling air of evening, carrying the savory scent of herbs and meat. "Thank you," she said, but he had already turned away to serve his own portion. They ate in silence, broken only by the crack of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against tin. The stew was flavorful and hearty, the meat tender from long cooking. Daniel sat at the far end of the table, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Gianna finished her meal and stood, gathering the empty bowls. "I'll wash these." Daniel looked up, startled. "No need. Please," she interrupted. "I insist. You cooked. It's only fair." A long moment passed before he nodded, returning his attention to the broken lantern he'd pulled from a shelf. His big fingers worked methodically at the rusted hinges as Gianna heated water for washing. The familiar task of dishwashing helped settle her nerves. She had just finished drying the last bowl when a long, mournful howl echoed through the darkness outside. Gianna jumped, nearly dropping the tin dish. "Wolves," Daniel said quietly, not looking up from his work. "They fear the fire more than us." His calm voice steadied her racing heart. The howls continued, but they seemed more distant now, a wild chorus that belonged to the mountain night. Daniel continued working on the lantern, his steady movements somehow reassuring. Snow began falling more heavily outside, visible through the window as white sheets in the lantern light. The cabin grew warmer as Daniel added another log to the fire, its light casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Thank you," Gianna said softly. "For the meal, and everything." Daniel's hands stilled on the lantern. "You don't owe me thanks, Mrs. Red," he replied, his voice low and serious. "Only truth." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Gianna turned away, unsure how to respond. She busied herself arranging her borrowed blankets on the narrow cot near the stove, while Daniel finished repairing the lantern. Night deepened outside the cabin walls. Daniel banked the fire carefully, checking that enough wood was stacked nearby to last until morning. He spread his bedroll near the door, maintaining a respectful distance that somehow made Gianna feel both safer and more uncertain. The cabin settled into darkness, save for the red glow of the stove. Gianna lay awake, listening to the strange sounds of the mountain night, the crack of branches under snow, the whisper of wind, the distant cry of an owl. Then, barely audible, she heard Daniel's voice, low and reverent in prayer. The words were too quiet to make out, but their rhythm was familiar, the cadence of someone speaking to God from the heart. His deep voice rose and fell like gentle waves, a sound both humble and certain. Gianna found herself holding her breath to listen, moved by the simple faith in his tone. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in the cocoon of warmth from the stove and the strange peace of Daniel's prayers. When she finally drifted off, it was to the soft murmur of his voice asking blessings for the night. Dawn arrived with pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Gianna woke to find the cabin already warm, a pot of coffee bubbling on the stove. Daniel's bedroll was neatly rolled and stored, and through the window she could see fresh-cut wood stacked by the door. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to chase away the morning chill. A note lay beside the pot, written in careful, slightly awkward letters. "Gone to check traps, back by noon, fire set, coffee hot." Gianna sat at the table, cradling the tin cup between her hands. The domestic peace of the morning settled around her like a familiar shawl, yet it brought with it a strange ache in her chest. This quiet care, this gentle consideration, it wasn't what she'd expected, wasn't what she'd been prepared to face. Fear she could have handled, cruelty she had steeled herself against. But this simple, steady kindness unsettled her more deeply than any harshness could have. She found herself studying the cabin with new eyes, seeing the signs of patient craft everywhere, the smooth-planed tabletop, the neat stitching on the curtains, the carefully arranged shelves of provisions. Outside, snow continued to fall in lazy spirals, adding to the thick blanket covering the ground. Smoke rose straight from the chimney into the pearl-gray sky, marking this place as a spot of warmth in the vast wilderness. Gianna touched the wooden ring on her finger, feeling its smooth grain, and wondered at how different reality could be from expectation. The morning stretched on, quiet and contemplative. She found herself straightening already neat shelves, sweeping the already clean floor, trying to keep her hands busy while her mind circled around the mystery of the man who had brought her here. Every detail of the cabin spoke of care and principle, so different from the wild tales whispered in town about the fearsome bear man. When she had nothing left to tidy, Gianna sat by the window with Daniel's Bible in her lap. The pages fell open to Psalms, marked with the dried pine needle. The margins held small, careful notes in the same hand as the morning's note, observations, questions, and prayers recorded in moments of solitude. She was still sitting there when the sound of boots on the porch announced Daniel's return. He stomped snow from his feet before entering, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of pine. Their eyes met briefly before his gaze dropped away, shy again in her presence. The domestic peace of the morning had changed something in Gianna's heart. Not dramatically, but subtly, like snow changing the shape of the landscape one flake at a time. She watched as Daniel moved quietly about his tasks, seeing now not a fearsome stranger, but a man who lived his faith in small, constant ways. A carefully built fire, a pot of coffee kept warm, a prayer whispered in darkness. It was this steady, unspoken goodness that unsettled her most deeply. Fear she had known how to fight. But kindness required a different kind of courage altogether. 3 days passed like water over stones, each one wearing away a little more of Gianna's initial fear. The mountain winter settled around the cabin in deep drifts of white, marking time with crystalline mornings and early sunsets. On the 4th morning, hoofbeats echoed up from the valley. Tom Wesley, one of the Henderson ranch hands, had ridden into Bitterroot Town with news about missing cattle. Over whiskey at the saloon, he mentioned seeing smoke from Daniel Red's cabin. "That Finch girl's gone up to the bear man's shack," he announced to the gathered crowd. "Saw the smoke myself, 2 chimneys worth." The news spread through town like wildfire. Women gathered in clusters outside the general store, their voices hushed with concern. Some clucked their tongues in pity, imagining Gianna trapped in some wild man's lair. Others whispered about scandal, questioning what kind of woman would stay with such a man. At the Bitterroot Saloon, Latham Pike held court, dealing cards with exaggerated flourishes as he spun tales. "Savage blood will tell," he drawled, encouraging the worst assumptions. "Mark my words, that girl's made her bed with a beast." But when Martha Cutter heard such talk, she marched straight to her husband's study. "Josiah," she declared, "you cannot let this stand." Reverend Cutter looked up from his Bible, his face troubled. "What would you have me do, Martha?" "Tell them the truth. You married?" "Them proper, with scripture and prayer. That man showed more Christian decency than half the town combined." The Reverend nodded slowly, gathering his courage. That Sunday he spoke from the pulpit about judgment and mercy. "I witnessed their vows myself," he declared. "Daniel Red came before God with honor, seeking a true marriage. Let those who would condemn first examine their own hearts." Meanwhile, up on Cold Creek Ridge, Daniel and Gianna fell into quiet routines that filled their days. Each morning, they hauled fresh water from the creek, breaking ice when necessary. Daniel showed her how to filter it through cloth to remove sediment, his instructions careful and clear. They worked side by side, mending what needed fixing. Gianna discovered she had a talent for patching clothes, while Daniel's strong hands were better suited to repairing tools and furniture. When she found his spare boots worn through at the heel, she spent an afternoon stitching them with heavy thread. "Much obliged," he said softly when she presented her work, turning the boots over in his hands to admire the neat stitches. The work of survival filled their hours. Daniel taught her to split wood safely, showing her how to read the grain and where to place the wedge. Though he could have done it faster alone, he never showed impatience with her learning. One morning, as Daniel was repairing a broken axe handle, the tool slipped. Blood welled from a deep cut across his palm. He made no sound, just wrapped his bandana around it and tried to continue working. "Let me help," Gianna said, stepping forward. "Please." Daniel hesitated, then slowly extended his hand. Gianna unwrapped the makeshift bandage, wincing at the angry red gash. She cleaned it carefully with water she'd boiled and cooled, then applied honey from their precious store, before wrapping it properly with clean cloth. Through it all, Daniel sat perfectly still, his eyes downcast. Only when she finished did he speak. "Thank you, Mrs. Red." "Gianna?" she corrected gently, surprising herself. "You can call me Gianna." He nodded once, still not meeting her eyes. His humility in accepting help touched something deep in her heart. This man, who others called savage, showed more grace in his silence than most men managed with grand speeches. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Daniel cleared his throat. "If you'd like to write to your father," he said carefully, "I can ride down tomorrow to deliver it." Gianna looked up sharply. "You'd do that?" Man should know his daughter's safe. Daniel's voice was soft but firm. "I'll need to fetch supplies anyway. Storm's coming next week." Gianna nodded slowly, emotion tightening her throat. She found paper and a pencil in Daniel's small desk, but when she sat down to write, words failed her. How could she explain these days to her father? The quiet dignity of this man he'd feared? The strange peace she'd found in this simple cabin? In the end, she wrote only, "Dear Father, I am safe and well. The cabin is warm, and there is plenty of food. Please don't worry. Your daughter, Gianna." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Daniel prepared for the ride to town, checking his horse's tack with careful hands. Gianna wrapped bread and dried meat for his journey, tucking it into his saddlebag along with her letter. She stood on the porch as he mounted up, watching until horse and rider disappeared into the timber trail. The forest seemed larger somehow without his steady presence. She realized with a start that she felt safer when he was near, not because she feared others, but because his quiet strength had become a comfort. Inside the cabin, she went about her daily tasks, sweeping the floor, checking the fire, preparing dried beans to soak. But her mind kept straying to the trail to town, imagining Daniel facing the stares and whispers. Would he hear Pike's mockery? Would anyone show him kindness? She found herself standing at the window more often than necessary, watching the path where he would return. The realization that she waited for him brought a flush to her cheeks. This wasn't the marriage she'd expected, forced by her father's debts, sealed by a wooden ring. But Daniel's patient decency had begun to shift something in her heart. The afternoon stretched long, shadows creeping across the snow. Gianna kept herself busy, but her ears strained for the sound of hoofbeats. She thought of Daniel's quiet prayers each night, his careful respect for her space, the gentle way he'd taught her the skills to survive here. How different he was from the bear man of town gossip. A jay's harsh cry made her jump. She realized she'd been standing at the window again, watching the trail disappear into the trees. The forest held its winter silence, broken only by the soft fall of snow from laden branches. Somewhere down that trail, Daniel rode through judgment and scorn, carrying her simple letter like a promise kept. She touched the wooden ring on her finger, feeling the smooth grain Daniel had carved with such care. Whatever the town thought, whatever shadows haunted him, she was beginning to understand that true strength lay not in fearsome reputations, but in quiet acts of faith, like a man who prayed in darkness and kept his word in light. The cabin felt both empty and full. Empty of Daniel's physical presence, but full of evidence of his character. Every neat stack of firewood, every carefully maintained tool, every small kindness spoke of a man who lived by principle rather than impulse. Gianna moved through the spaces he'd created, seeing with new eyes how every detail reflected thoughtful care. She prepared supper as the day waned, setting out 2 plates more from habit than hope that he'd return before dark. The familiar tasks of domestic life anchored her while her thoughts wandered down the snowy trail to town, where she knew tongues wagged and judgment flew freely. Yet here in the cabin, built by Daniel's hands and warmed by his quiet faith, those voices seemed to lose their power. The contrast between town gossip and mountain truth stood stark as shadow on snow. While Latham Pike spun tales of savagery in his smoky saloon, Daniel's Bible lay open on the table, its margins filled with honest wrestling toward grace. While women whispered about her shame, she found herself becoming stronger in this place of simple honor. The wood stove ticked softly as it cooled. Gianna wrapped herself in a quilt and sat by the window, watching darkness gather in the trees. She thought of Daniel riding home through the cold, bearing whatever barbs the town had flung, carrying supplies they needed, and keeping his word about her letter. The knowledge that he would return, steady as the sunrise, gave her a peace she hadn't expected to find in this forced marriage. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. A soft, questioning sound. Gianna remained by the window, waiting, finally understanding that safety could wear many faces, and strength could speak in silence, and sometimes grace arrived in unexpected ways, like a carved wooden ring offered with humble dignity in the dawn. The days stretched like honey from a spoon, slow and sweet with routine. Gianna found comfort in the simple rhythms of cabin life while waiting for Daniel's return. Each morning she stoked the fire until the iron stove glowed warm, then mixed cornmeal and the last of their flour with careful hands. The cabin filled with the homey scent of baking cornbread. She'd learned to gauge the heat just right, listening for the gentle crack of the crust against the pan. While it baked, she kept her hands busy with small tasks, sweeping the packed earth floor, arranging dried herbs in neat bundles, straightening the few dishes they owned. In quiet moments, she sat at the sturdy table Daniel had built and opened his well-worn Bible. The pages were soft at the edges from frequent turning, and she noticed small marks in the margins where his strong hands had traced meaningful verses. She began reading aloud, her voice filling the cabin's silence. The familiar words brought both comfort and sharp pangs of memory. Her father had once read these same passages in their little parlor, back when he still believed in more than cards and whiskey. Homesickness hit her in waves. She missed her small room above the schoolhouse, the cheerful quilt her mother had sewn, even the creak of that loose floorboard by her bed. But mostly she missed who her father had been before grief and gambling hollowed him out. The shame of his choices burned fresh each time she thought of that night in the saloon. How he'd traded her future for his debts, his signature shaky on that cruel contract. The second day dawned cold and clear. Gianna watched the sun catch on ice-rimed branches while she worked through their dwindling supplies. The routine helped push back the memories, but she couldn't help wondering if her father even noticed her absence. Did he sit alone in their empty rooms, regretting his choices? Or had he already lost himself again in Pike's smoky salon? By the third day, the waiting had worn thin. Gianna paced between window and door, watching the trail for any sign of movement. The short winter day began fading into dusk, painting the snow in shades of blue and purple. She had just decided to bank the fire for the night when she heard the steady crunch of hooves in snow. Daniel appeared through the trees like a shadow taking shape. His dark coat was dusted white, and his horse's breath steamed in the cold air. He dismounted slowly, as if tired, and led his mount to the small barn. Gianna's heart quickened. She hadn't realized how much she'd worried until she saw him safe returned. She waited while he tended to his horse, her hands twisting in her apron. When he finally entered the cabin, he carried several packages wrapped in brown paper. Without ceremony, he set them on the table: a cloth-wrapped bundle of flour, a spool of sturdy thread, and some other basic supplies they'd needed. "Thank you," Gianna said softly, touching the fresh flour with gratitude. They'd been nearly out. Daniel nodded once, but something in his stance made her pause. He seemed to be holding himself more carefully than usual, like a man bearing unwelcome news. "My father," she said, the words barely a whisper. "Did you see him?" Daniel's dark eyes met hers briefly before looking away. "Yes, ma'am." "The letter?" He took a slow breath. "He wouldn't take it. Said some harsh words. Cursed me some." His voice held no anger, only a deep sadness. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Red." The truth hit her like a physical blow. Gianna pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob that rose in her throat. But the tears came anyway, hot and bitter. Her father hadn't even wanted to know if she was safe. The last thread of hope she'd been clinging to, that somehow he might make things right, snapped clean through. She turned away, ashamed of her tears. Behind her, Daniel's boots scraped on the floor as he moved toward the door. She heard it open and close softly as he left her to her grief. Through watery eyes, she watched him through the window as he began stacking firewood with methodical care. He offered no empty words of comfort, no awkward attempts to soothe her pain. Instead, he gave her the dignity of privacy while staying close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. The winter dark settled fully around the cabin. Gianna wiped her eyes and lit the lamp, its gentle glow pushing back the shadows. She should sleep, she knew, but rest felt impossible with her thoughts churning like creek water over rocks. After an hour of tossing on her cot, she rose and wrapped herself in a shawl. The night air bit sharp when she opened the door. Moonlight turned the snow to silver, bright enough to see clearly. She meant to find Daniel and thank him for the supplies, for delivering her letter, despite her father's cruelty, for his quiet understanding of her tears. But the words died in her throat at what she saw. Daniel knelt in the snow at the edge of the clearing, his dark head bowed. His voice carried soft on the still air as he prayed, asking not for justice but for mercy. "Lord, watch over Samuel Finch, ease his troubled spirit, help him find his way back to you, back to his daughter's heart." Gianna stood frozen, wonder replacing her grief. This man, whom her father had cursed, whom the town feared, was praying for mercy on her father's soul. The pure grace of it struck her speechless. She had expected Daniel to be angry at Samuel's rejection, or at least indifferent to his fate. Instead, he knelt in the snow, asking God to heal the very man who had wronged them both. She backed quietly into the cabin, unwilling to interrupt such a private moment. Her hands trembled as she lit a fresh candle from the lamp. Setting it carefully on the table, She sank to her knees beside Daniel's Bible. For the first time since that terrible night in the saloon, she felt truly moved to pray. "Lord," she whispered, "watch over Daniel Red. Thank you for his kindness, his patience, his forgiveness." She touched the wooden ring he'd carved for her, feeling the smooth grain under her fingers. "Help me learn to see with his eyes and judge with his heart." The candle flame danced, casting soft shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the moon sailed between scattered clouds, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called to its mate. Gianna remained on her knees, letting peace settle over her like fresh snow. Her anger toward her father hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into something gentler. A sad acceptance softened by Daniel's example of mercy. When Daniel finally came inside, stamping snow from his boots, Gianna had composed herself. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table without words. His quiet "thank you" held volumes of understanding. They sat in comfortable silence while the fire popped and settled in the stove. Looking at him in the lamplight, Gianna realized her perception had shifted fundamentally. The bear man of town gossip, the feared recluse she'd been forced to marry, that shadow had dissolved completely. In its place sat a man of profound faith and careful honor, who answered hatred with prayer and offered strength through service rather than force. The shame she'd carried since her father's betrayal began to lose its sharp edges. How could she remain bitter when Daniel showed such grace? How could she dwell in anger when he chose mercy? The lesson settled deep in her heart, changing her from the inside out, like spring thaw reshaping the land beneath the snow. The early spring morning dawned with unusual warmth, sending rivulets of melting snow down the cabin's roof. Gianna stood at the door, watching winter's grip slowly loosen on the mountain. The sun had a different quality now, softer, more golden, as it filtered through bare branches and cast long shadows across patches of thinning snow. She had just finished hanging fresh linens when she heard it, the distinctive sound of horse hooves crunching through spring crust. Daniel was out checking his trap lines, and they rarely had visitors this high up the ridge. Shielding her eyes against the glare, Gianna made out a rider approaching along the narrow trail. The stranger sat tall in an expensive eastern saddle, his coat too fine for normal trail wear. His horse, a sleek bay gelding, picked its way carefully between the melting drifts. As he drew closer, Gianna noted his clean-shaven face and city-tailored clothes. Definitely not a local rancher or trapper. The man reined his horse to a stop in the yard and removed his hat with a practiced flourish. "Good day, madam. Might I trouble you for some water? The climb up here is steeper than I expected." His smile was pleasant enough, but something in his appraising gaze made Gianna uneasy. "Of course," she replied, keeping her voice even. "There's a pump by the barn." "Much obliged." He dismounted smoothly and led his horse over. "I'm Harlan Price, representing the Great Northern Railroad Company." He pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his coat. "I don't suppose Mr. Red is about?" "He's checking his trap lines. He should return soon." Gianna watched as Price worked the pump handle, filling his canteen. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, like a man used to being observed. "No matter. I can start my preliminary survey while I wait." Price secured his horse and began walking the property line, consulting papers and making notes. He paid particular attention to Daniel's boundary markers, measuring distances with practiced steps. Gianna continued her chores, but kept Price in view as he circled the cabin. Something about his presence felt wrong, like a fox in a henhouse. When Daniel's familiar figure finally appeared through the trees, She felt her shoulders relax. Daniel took in the situation at a glance. He secured his gear and approached Price with measured steps. "Can I help you?" Price turned with that same practiced smile. "Ah, Mr. Red, I was hoping to catch you." He extended his hand. "Harlan Price, Great Northern Railroad. I wonder if we might discuss some business over supper?" "My treat. I brought provisions." He patted his saddlebags. Daniel studied him for a long moment before nodding once. "We've got stew on already. You're welcome to share." Inside the cabin, Gianna added extra vegetables to the pot while Daniel and Price settled at the table. Price laid out his papers with flourish, speaking of progress and opportunity. But it wasn't until they were seated with full bowls that he revealed his true purpose. "The railroad's expanding, you see. This valley's a natural route through the mountains." Price spooned up stew with obvious appreciation. "Excellent cooking, Mrs. Red. As I was saying, the company's been quietly acquiring land rights throughout the territory. There's talk of iron deposits in these ridges, very valuable to a growing railroad." Daniel's face remained impassive. "This land's already claimed." "Ah, yes." Price dabbed his mouth with a fine linen handkerchief. "About that. I've been reviewing property records in town. There seems to be some irregularity regarding your claim. Something about a marriage contract tied to a gambling debt?" His eyes slid to Gianna. "Such arrangements can be legally questionable, especially if the original debt note was obtained through, shall we say, improper means?" Gianna's hands clenched in her lap. The suggestion that her marriage to Daniel might be invalidated sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the spring weather. She looked to Daniel, whose expression had grown very still. "Paper or no," Daniel said quietly. "What's built here is honest." Price's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. "Honesty is a fine thing, Mr. Red, but the law has certain requirements. I'd hate to see anyone's position compromised by technical oversights." He gathered his papers with precise movements. "I'll be in town for several days, settling various matters. Do think carefully about your situation." The threat in his words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel rose and walked Price to his horse in silence. When he returned, Gianna was still sitting at the table, her stew gone cold. "Daniel?" Her voice wavered slightly. He shook his head. "Don't fret yet." Moving to the fireplace, he added another log and adjusted the flames. "Man like that, his words are slippery as spring ice. We'll need wisdom to see clear." Outside, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, an early spring storm building in the mountains. Daniel held out his hand to Gianna. "Shall we pray?" She took his calloused fingers in hers, drawing strength from their warmth. Together they knelt before the fire's glow. Daniel's deep voice merged with the distant thunder as he asked for guidance, for clarity, for protection of their home and peace. Gianna added her own silent prayers, for courage to face whatever came, for strength to stand beside this good man, for wisdom to see through Price's schemes. The fire crackled and sparked. Thunder growled closer, and spring rain began to patter against the cabin roof. Daniel's final "Amen" was almost lost in a tremendous thunderclap that shook the windows. They remained kneeling together as lightning flickered through the gathering dusk, each lost in thought about the trials that lay ahead. The warmth of the fire couldn't quite dispel the chill Price's visit had left behind. But Gianna found comfort in Daniel's steady presence beside her, in the honest work of their hands that had built this home, in the truth of their growing bond that went far deeper than any paper contract. Later, as she prepared for bed, Gianna watched Daniel making his final check of the property through the storm. His figure moved sure-footed through the rain, securing things against the wind. She thought about how far they'd come from that terrible night in the saloon, how this forced marriage had slowly transformed into something real and precious. No, she decided firmly. Mr. Price's threats couldn't touch what truly mattered. Whatever challenges the railroad man might bring, she and Daniel would face them together, with prayer and honest hearts. The thunder rolled again, but this time Gianna heard it not as a warning, but as heaven's own affirmation of their stand. The cabin glowed like a beacon through the storm, a testament to the home they'd built here. Not just the physical structure, but the deeper foundation of trust and respect between them. As Daniel came in from his rounds, shaking rain from his coat, Gianna handed him a warm cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and they shared a look of quiet understanding. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would meet it side by side. The spring sleet drummed against the telegraph office window as Reverend Josiah Cutter read the yellow paper in his trembling hands for the third time. The message from Missoula was clear. Railroad interests were making their move across the territory, pressuring landowners through any means necessary. Martha touched his arm. "What troubles you, Josiah?" He folded the telegram carefully, tucking it into his Bible. "The railroad company has been buying judges in Helena. They're overturning homestead claims, Martha. All legal-like, but—" He shook his head. "But not right in the eyes of the Lord," she finished softly. "The town council's already pressing me to stay quiet about it." Josiah moved to his desk, where Sunday's sermon lay half-written. "They say the railroad could bypass us entirely if we make trouble. No station means no growth, no new families. And no truth means no honor," Martha replied. She began straightening the small room's few belongings, her way of sorting through difficult matters. "That Daniel Red has shown more Christian character than half the council combined. That's what weighs on me." Josiah picked up his pen, but didn't write. "How can I preach God's word while staying silent about injustice?" Outside, wagon wheels creaked through the mud. Martha peered out the window. "Speaking of the Reds, they're coming down the valley road now." Several miles north, Daniel and Gianna had started their journey to town before dawn. The wagon moved slowly through the spring muck, horses straining against the wet clay. Sleet stung their faces despite the oiled canvas Daniel had rigged as a partial cover. "We could have stayed home," Daniel said, noting Gianna's reddened cheeks. She shook her head. "I want to attend proper service. Besides," she added with a small smile, "the town needs to see us as we are, not as they imagine." Daniel nodded, respecting her courage. The past weeks had shown him more of her, quiet strength, like a mountain stream cutting through stone. They rode on in comfortable silence, sharing the peace of the gray morning. As they approached town, the sleet finally eased. Gianna saw curtains twitch in windows, faces turning to watch their passage. Daniel helped her down from the wagon in front of the small white church, his hands steady and sure. Inside, the whispers began immediately. Living alone up there with that half-breed. Her poor father, drinking worse than ever. Railroad man asking questions about property lines. Gianna held her head high as Daniel led her to a pew. She noticed Martha Cutter giving them an encouraging smile from her seat near the front. The whispering continued until Reverend Cutter took his place at the pulpit. "Today's sermon," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "concerns forgiveness." His eyes moved over the congregation, lingering on Daniel and Gianna. Not just receiving God's forgiveness, but extending it to others, even when doing so comes at great personal cost. As the preacher spoke, his words seemed to tremble with unspoken burden. He gripped the pulpit tightly, speaking of conscience and moral courage. When he quoted scripture about standing firm in truth, his gaze drifted to the telegram hidden in his Bible. "For what profit is it," he asked, voice growing stronger, "if a man gains the whole world but loses his soul? We must ask ourselves, what price are we willing to pay for progress? What treasures do we trade for earthly gain?" Several town council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Gianna felt Daniel's arm brush against hers, solid as oak. She had seen him pray often enough now to recognize the quiet reverence in his posture. This was a man who took such questions seriously. After the service, people gathered in small clusters, their voices low but carrying in the crisp air. Gianna moved toward Martha Cutter, but stopped when she heard her name. "Can't be legal. A marriage forced by gambling debt. Pike says the railroad's lawyers will sort it quick enough. Shame about the land, prime spot for the depot they're planning." Daniel's hand found her elbow, gentle but grounding. He guided her toward Reverend Cutter, who stood alone by the church steps. "Thank you for your words today, Reverend," Daniel said simply. The preacher's face showed relief at this straightforward greeting. "Mr. Red, Mrs. Red, I'm glad you could attend." Cutter's eyes held apology and something like admiration. "These are difficult times for many." "Truth often is," Daniel replied. He nodded respectfully and led Gianna back to their wagon. The return journey began quietly, both lost in thought as the horses plodded through the mud. The sleet had turned to a fine, cold rain that beaded on their wool coats. About a mile out of town, Daniel drew the wagon to a stop near a grove of pines. "There's something you should know," he said, his deep voice matching the solemnity of the day. "Before I came to these mountains, I served as a scout for the army." Gianna turned to study his face. This confession clearly cost him something to share. "I tracked for the cavalry units," he continued, eyes on the distant ridges. "Used my mother's knowledge of Apache ways, my father's skill with horses. Told myself I was helping keep peace." His jaw tightened, "until I saw what some men called peace was just conquest by another name." "What happened?" Gianna asked softly. "They ordered us to find a band of families, women, children, elders, who'd fled the reservation." His hands tightened on the reins. "Said they were hostiles. But I knew they were just hungry, trying to reach their traditional hunting grounds." He fell silent for a long moment. "I led the troops away from their true trail. Then I deserted, came north to these mountains where a man might live by his own conscience." Gianna absorbed this, understanding better now his chosen solitude, his careful way of moving through the world. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He turned to meet her gaze directly. "You deserve to know. With Pike and his railroad men circling, there might be questions about my past. I won't have you caught unaware by their accusations." The truth of his past should have frightened her. This man who had tracked for the army, who had turned his back on that life for the sake of conscience. Instead, she felt her trust in him deepen. Here was someone who understood the cost of standing for what was right. "We'll face whatever comes together," she said firmly. Daniel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. The corners of his mouth softened. Not quite a smile, but close. He clicked to the horses, and they moved on through the rain. As they traveled, Gianna thought about the morning's sermon, about forgiveness and moral courage. She thought about the telegram that had troubled Reverend Cutter, about the whispers in town, about this quiet man beside her who had chosen conscience over comfort. The rain continued steady and cold, but Gianna felt warmth in her heart. Whatever challenges Pike and his railroad might bring, she knew now that she stood on solid ground. Daniel's honesty had given her something stronger than fear. It had given her faith in the power of truth. They rode on toward home, the wagon wheels cutting fresh tracks through the mud, while overhead the clouds began to part, letting through thin shafts of spring sunlight. The mountain stood silent witness to their journey, ancient and unchanging against the weather's whims. The mountain night wrapped around the cabin like a thick blanket. Inside, the fire cast dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls as Daniel stood near the hearth. His broad shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight as he faced Gianna, who sat quietly in her chair, her mending forgotten in her lap. "There's more you need to know," Daniel said, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "About who I am, where I come from." He paused, gathering thoughts like a man collecting scattered arrows. "My mother was Apache, White Mountain people. My father, a Scots-Irish trader who loved her true and proper." Gianna watched his face in the firelight, seeing how the flames caught the proud angles of his features, the heritage written in his bones. She remained silent, giving him space to continue. "They taught me both worlds, reading scripture and tracking deer, speaking English and Apache ways." His eyes grew distant. "When they died of fever, I was 18. The army recruited me as a scout, said my skills could help keep peace between settlers and tribes." He moved to add another log to the fire, the familiar task steadying his hands. "At first, I believed them. Thought I could be a bridge between worlds, help prevent bloodshed. Used my mother's knowledge of the land, my father's way with horses." The wood settled with a shower of sparks. "But peace wasn't what they wanted." Gianna's hands tightened on her skirt as Daniel continued, his voice growing rough with memory. "They ordered us to track a band of families, women, children, elders, called them hostiles, but I knew better. They were just hungry, trying to reach their traditional hunting grounds after the agency cut their rations again." He stood very still, staring into the flames. "I led the troops away from the true trail, gave those families a chance. But another scout found them." His jaw clenched. "I heard the shots, the screams, saw what was left afterward." Tears slid silently down Gianna's cheeks as Daniel spoke of that dark day. "I couldn't stay. Turned my horse and rode away that night. They shot me as I fled, got me in the shoulder." His hand touched the spot briefly. "Made it north, into these mountains. Been here since, trying to live quiet and harm no one." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Gianna wiped her eyes with trembling fingers, her heart aching for the weight he'd carried alone. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling me, for trusting me with the truth." Daniel nodded once, his eyes meeting hers with a glimpse of vulnerability that made him seem more human than ever. "You deserved to know, especially now, with trouble coming." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Daniel mentioned a trapline bridge needed repair, and Gianna surprised him by offering to help. They worked together through the morning, her smaller hands proving useful in tying off the lighter ropes, while he secured the main supports. "Hand me that length of hemp rope, Daniel," she said without thinking, then paused, realizing she'd used his given name for the first time. He looked up, a flash of warmth crossing his features before he passed her the rope. Their days fell into a rhythm after that, shared work, quiet meals, evening prayers. Gianna found herself watching him sometimes, seeing past the imposing figure to the man beneath, careful with small things, gentle with animals, faithful in his daily devotions. The fear that had first gripped her heart in the Bitterroot Saloon seemed like a distant memory. One evening, As Gianna sat mending one of Daniel's shirts by lamplight, hoofbeats sounded outside. Daniel rose quickly, taking his rifle from its peg, but his movements were controlled, not panicked. "Stay inside," he told her quietly, stepping out onto the porch. Through the window, Gianna heard voices, then recognized one that made her heart stutter. Her father. She hurried to the door despite Daniel's warning. Samuel Finch sat slumped on a tired horse in the yard. The moonlight showed how gaunt he'd become, and a wet cough shook his frame. "Come to see my daughter," he managed between coughs. "Make sure she's safe." "Papa?" Gianna stepped onto the porch, Daniel's solid presence beside her like a shield. "Gianna, girl," Samuel's voice cracked. "I had to know, had to see." Another coughing fit doubled him over. Daniel lowered his rifle. "He's sick, needs shelter." He turned to Gianna, leaving the choice to her. She studied her father, the man who'd gambled away her future, who'd avoided her letter. But he was still her father, and he looked so ill. "The barn," she said finally. "He can rest there tonight." Daniel nodded and moved to help Samuel down from his horse. The older man could barely walk, leaning heavily on Daniel's arm as they made their way to the barn. Gianna hurried to gather blankets and some soup she'd made earlier. In the barn, Daniel arranged clean straw and helped Samuel settle. Gianna brought the supplies, her heart twisting at how frail her father looked. "Much obliged," Samuel mumbled, pulling the blankets close. "Just needed to see. My girl was all right." "Rest now," Gianna said softly. "We'll talk in the morning." Back in the cabin, Daniel built up the fire while Gianna stood at the window, watching the barn. "He's changed," she said quietly. "People can," Daniel replied, but his tone held a note of caution. That night, Gianna dreamed of peace, of her father well again, of the three of them sharing a meal without shadows between them. She dreamed of spring flowers and gentle rain, of healing old wounds and building new trust. But in the barn, Samuel Finch lay awake, his coughing real, but his eyes sharp as he fingered a folded paper in his coat pocket. His gaunt face reflected orange in the lantern light as he studied the barn's construction, noting the dry hay, the wooden walls, the single door. His thoughts turned to Pike's promises, to the money that would solve all his troubles if he just played his part well enough. "Lord, forgive me," he whispered, but his eyes remained calculating in the darkness. The night deepened around the cabin and barn, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, Gianna slept on, her dream of peace as fragile as morning frost. Daniel knelt by his bed, praying longer than usual, his warrior's instincts sensing trouble ahead despite his desire to believe in redemption. In the barn, Samuel coughed again, clutching Pike's letter closer, while owls called across the valley and the moon cast shadows like judgment through the cracks in the walls. The night held its breath, waiting for morning to reveal which way truth would fall. The morning sun had barely touched the mountain peaks when Daniel climbed onto the cabin's roof. Shingles needed replacing before spring rains came, and the work couldn't wait. The wood felt solid beneath his boots as he knelt to examine loose boards. Inside, Gianna prepared breakfast while her father dozed in the barn. The past few days, Samuel had grown stronger, though a shadow seemed to linger in his eyes. She carried a plate of biscuits outside, shielding her eyes to watch Daniel work. "Brought you something to eat," she called up. Daniel nodded his thanks, carefully making his way to the edge of the roof. As he reached for the plate, they heard the soft thunder of hoofbeats. Samuel emerged from the barn, already mounted on his horse. "Just heading down to fetch my medicine from Doc Turner," he called, waving off their concern. Won't be but a few hours." Gianna frowned. "Papa, wait. I can ride with you." "No need, daughter. You stay and help your—" Samuel hesitated, the word husband catching in his throat. "Help Daniel with the roof." He turned his horse toward town before she could protest. Daniel watched the older man ride away, his face unreadable. Something in Samuel's manner set his instincts humming, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Instead, he gestured to the pile of new shingles. "Mind handing those up?" They worked through the morning, the steady rhythm of hammer and nails filling the air. Gianna proved quick to learn, passing tools and holding boards as Daniel showed her. The sun climbed higher, warming the early spring day. Meanwhile, in town, Samuel Finch tied his horse outside the Western Union office. His shoulders hunched as he pushed open the door, finding Harlan Price waiting inside. The railroad man's silk vest and gold watch chain gleamed in the dusty light. "Ah, Mr. Finch." Price's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Right on time. Please, sit." Samuel sank into the offered chair, coughing slightly. "You said you had papers for me to sign?" "Indeed." Price spread several documents across the desk. "Simply confirming what you told us about Mr. Red's land claim, the irregularities in his homestead filing, his history with the Army." He slid a pen toward Samuel. "Sign here and here. Your testimony could prove very useful." Samuel's hand trembled as he took the pen. "And you promise? No harm will come to the boy?" "My dear Mr. Finch." Price's voice dripped false sincerity. "This is merely a legal matter. Mr. Red will be treated with all due process." He reached beneath the desk, producing a canvas bag that clinked heavily. "Your payment, as discussed, $500 in gold eagles." The coin's weight felt like judgment in Samuel's hands. He thought of Daniel's quiet strength, of how the young man had sheltered him despite everything. But the gold spoke louder than conscience. His signature scratched across the papers like a death warrant. "Excellent." Price gathered the documents, tucking them into his briefcase. "You've done the right thing, Mr. Finch. Progress requires sacrifice, after all." Samuel stumbled out into the street, the bag of coins hidden beneath his coat. Bile rose in his throat as he mounted his horse. Behind him, Price stepped onto the boardwalk, watching him ride away with cold satisfaction. Back at the cabin, Daniel and Gianna had finished the roof by mid-afternoon. She watched him stack the leftover shingles, admiring how the sun had darkened his skin to bronze. A movement in the distant trees caught her eye. "Daniel, there's riders out there." He turned slowly, scanning the ridge line. 3 men on horseback moved through the timber, too far to make out faces. They weren't trying to hide, but something about their presence made the hair rise on Daniel's neck. "Price's men," he said quietly. "Been watching the valley since yesterday. Why didn't you tell me?" "No need to worry you." He guided her toward the cabin. "Not yet." Inside, Daniel built up the fire while Gianna started supper. Neither spoke of the watchers in the hills, but tension hung in the air like smoke. As the sun set, they heard Samuel's horse in the yard. "Papa!" Gianna hurried out to help him dismount. "You were gone so long, we worried. Just visiting with old friends." Samuel wouldn't meet her eyes. "Doc Turner sends his regards." Daniel stood in the doorway, noting how Samuel's coat bulged oddly, how his hands shook as he unsaddled his horse. But when he spoke, his voice remained gentle. "Supper's nearly ready. You're welcome to join us." They gathered around the table, Daniel's own handiwork, solid pine smoothed by careful hands. Gianna served beans and cornbread, the everyday meal somehow special in the lamplight. Steam rose from their cups like prayer. "Thank you for coming back," Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Means much to Gianna, having her father here." Samuel stared at his plate, fork motionless. The food turned to ashes in his mouth as guilt gnawed his belly. I should rest. Not feeling well." He pushed back from the table, fleeing to the barn before anyone could respond. Gianna started to rise, but Daniel touched her arm. "Let him be. Sometimes a man needs space with his thoughts." She sank back down, troubled. "Something's wrong. He's hiding something. Your father carries heavy burdens." Daniel chose his words carefully. "We can only pray he finds his way through them." After the dishes were done, Gianna took a blanket out to the barn. She found Samuel huddled in the straw, his face gray in the lantern light. "Papa, are you truly ill?" "Just tired, girl." He managed a weak smile. "Don't fret over your old father." She spread the blanket over him, remembering how he used to tuck her in as a child. "I love you, Papa. Whatever's troubling you, we can face it together." Samuel turned away, unable to bear her trust. "Good night, daughter." Outside the barn, Daniel stood in the yard, scanning the darkened valley. No sign now of Price's riders, but he felt their presence like a weight on his shoulders. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant as judgment. He knelt in the dirt, bowhead bowed. "Lord," he whispered, "grant me wisdom to see clear and strength to do right." The night wind carried his prayer away into the waiting darkness. Inside the cabin, Gianna prepared for bed, her heart uneasy despite her chosen hope. She thought of her father's strange behavior, of the mysterious riders, of Daniel's quiet vigilance. Something was building, like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. But for now, she could only wait and pray and trust in the foundation of truth they'd built together. Daniel remained outside long after the others slept, keeping watch over his home and family. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for morning to reveal what price betrayal would demand. But that revelation would come soon enough. For now there was only the night, the stars, and a man's prayers rising like smoke into the endless Montana sky. In the barn, Samuel clutched the bag of blood money to his chest, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. The coin's weight pressed against his heart like stones, each one marking a betrayal of the man who'd shown him nothing but kindness. He thought of Price's cold smile, of Daniel's trusting words at supper, and knew that whatever came next would haunt him to his grave. The night deepened around the cabin and barn, while far off in the timber, unseen riders kept their vigil. Change was coming to Cold Creek Ridge, carried on the wings of progress and greed. But for this moment, peace still reigned, fragile as morning frost, precious as a daughter's love, fleeting as a father's honor. The mountain air grew sharp with cold as darkness settled over Cold Creek Ridge 2 nights after Samuel's return. Inside the cabin, Gianna stirred the stew pot hanging over the hearth, while Daniel read from his worn Bible by lamplight. Samuel dozed in the corner, his face troubled even in sleep. The peace shattered with the thunder of hooves. Daniel's head snapped up at the sound. He closed the Bible carefully, rising to his feet as shouts and the gleam of torches filled the yard. Gianna rushed to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. "At least 8 riders," Daniel said quietly. His calm voice steadied her, though she saw his hand tighten on the chair back. "Stay inside." Before he could reach the door, it burst open. Men in dark coats poured in, boots muddy on the clean floor. Their leader, tall and grim-faced, held up a paper that gleamed official in the lamplight. "Daniel Red," the man barked, "you're under arrest by authority of the United States. Army for desertion and treason." Gianna's world tilted sideways. "No," she whispered. "There must be some mistake." Samuel jerked awake, staggering to his feet. "Wait," he croaked. You promised—" "Quiet, old man." One of the riders backhanded Samuel, sending him sprawling. Gianna cried out, rushing to her father's side. Outside, orange light flared as torches arced through the air. The dry wood of the barn caught like tinder, flames racing up the walls. The horses inside screamed in terror. Daniel stood very still, his eyes moving from Gianna to the burning barn, to the men with guns. When he spoke, his voice held no fear, only sadness. "Your papers are forged. I can see the ink's fresh." "Doesn't matter," the leader sneered. "You're coming with us, half-breed deserter, unless you want to watch your woman burn with the barn." Two men grabbed Daniel's arms. He didn't resist as they snapped iron manacles around his wrists, though Gianna saw the muscles in his jaw clench. The firelight threw his face into sharp relief. Proud, resolute, unbroken. "Daniel!" Gianna tried to run to him, but Samuel caught her arm, holding her back. "Please, don't take him!" Daniel turned as they dragged him toward the door. His eyes met hers, dark with an emotion she couldn't name. "Keep faith, Gianna," he called out, his voice strong and clear above the chaos. Then they pushed him into the night. The barn was an inferno now, sparks whirling up against the stars. Smoke rolled through the yard in choking waves. Gianna heard the terrible screams of trapped animals and lurched towards the blazing structure, but Samuel pulled her away. "The horses!" she sobbed. "We have to save them!" "Too late," Samuel's voice cracked. "It's all too late!" They huddled in the yard, watching helplessly as the barn collapsed in a shower of embers. The riders had vanished into the darkness with Daniel, leaving only destruction in their wake. Through the long hours until dawn, Gianna and Samuel fought to keep the cabin from catching fire, passing buckets of well water back and forth until their arms shook with exhaustion. Morning revealed the full extent of the devastation. The barn was nothing but smoking ruins, the careful work of Daniel's hands reduced to ash and charred timber. Their horses, their stores, their hope of surviving the winter, all gone. Gianna stood in the yard, her dress and face smudged with soot, staring at the destruction. Samuel hadn't spoken since the riders left. He sat on the cabin steps, head bowed, something gleaming at his feet. Gianna walked over slowly, her boots crunching in the frost. A canvas bag lay open beside him, spilling gold coins onto the dirt. "Papa?" Her voice was hardly more than a whisper. "What is this?" Samuel's shoulders began to shake. I thought I was saving you," he choked out. "From poverty, from shame, from being tied to a man everyone feared." He picked up a coin with trembling fingers. "Price said they'd just move him off the land, said no one would be hurt." Understanding crashed over Gianna like ice water. "You sold him out." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "You took money to betray him." "I was wrong." Samuel's cry was raw with anguish. "I see that now. Dear God, what have I done? He took us in, showed us nothing but kindness, and I—" He buried his face in his hands, shoulders heaving with sobs. Gianna stared down at her father. This broken man who had gambled away her future twice now, first with cards, then with Daniel's freedom. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but carried the weight of judgment. "You've sold the only man who ever showed us mercy." Samuel flinched as if she'd struck him. Around them, thin wisps of smoke still rose from the ruins of the barn. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard where, just yesterday, Daniel had split wood and talked of spring planting. Now there was only ash and betrayal and the echoing absence of his quiet strength. Gianna picked up the bag of coins, each one blood money that had bought Daniel's arrest. The gold felt heavy and cold in her hands. With sudden decision, she walked to the well and dropped the bag in. It disappeared into the dark water with a distant splash. "What do we do now?" Samuel asked, his voice small and lost. Gianna turned to face the rising sun, her spine straight despite the weight of grief on her shoulders. Daniel's last words echoed in her mind. Keep faith. She would need that faith now more than ever. The homestead lay in ruins around them, everything Daniel had built destroyed in a single night of fire and treachery. But Gianna felt a different kind of fire kindling in her heart, one made of determination, not destruction. She would find a way to make this right. She had to. Daniel's life depended on it. Behind her, Samuel began to weep again, the sound of a man drowning in the consequences of his choices. But Gianna couldn't comfort him now. Her tears had dried in the heat of the flames, leaving behind a steel-hard resolve. Dawn painted the mountains gold, the same color as the coins now rusting at the bottom of the well. A new day was beginning, but for Gianna and Daniel, the darkest hour was not yet past. The smoke continued to rise from the ashes of their dreams, carrying with it the bitter scent of betrayal. But somewhere in the distance, Daniel was being carried away in chains, trusting her to keep faith. And that faith, Gianna decided, would have to be enough to light their way through whatever darkness lay ahead. From the burned ruins of the barn, a single beam still stood against the sky, charred but unbroken. Like Daniel's spirit, Gianna thought. It refused to fall. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on her face, and began to pray. Not for mercy, but for strength. They would need both before this story reached its end. The morning after the raid, Gianna found the Bible beneath the scorched timbers. Its leather cover was blackened, pages curled and brittle from the heat. With trembling hands, she carried it to a tall pine that had sheltered Daniel during his evening prayers. There, she dug a small hole and fashioned a cross from 2 straight branches, binding them with twine. "The word endures," she whispered, remembering how Daniel would read by lamplight. She buried the burned Bible with care, marking the spot with the wooden cross. It felt right somehow, sacred ground for sacred things. Inside the cabin, Samuel's cough grew worse. The smoke had settled deep in his lungs, and guilt seemed to weigh even heavier on his spirit. Gianna tended him with quiet determination, brewing willow bark tea and bathing his fevered brow. Though her heart ached with betrayal, she couldn't turn away from his suffering. "Forgive me," he would mumble between coughing fits. "Please forgive me, daughter." She would squeeze his hand, but couldn't find the words he sought. Instead, she prayed, for Daniel's safety, for her father's peace, for strength to face whatever lay ahead. On the 3rd day, as dawn painted the mountains rose gold, Samuel drew his last labored breath. Gianna sat beside him until the sun cleared the ridge, then gently closed his eyes. Among the things they'd saved from the fire was a beautiful quilt, its pattern speaking of Apache heritage. Daniel had once mentioned his mother made it. Gianna wrapped her father's body in those careful stitches, feeling the weight of both justice and mercy in the act. She chose a spot near the stream where wild roses would bloom come spring. The earth was hard with frost, but she dug deep, each shovelful a meditation on love and loss. When the grave was ready, she lowered him in and read from memory the Psalms Daniel had often quoted. "Rest easy, Papa," she whispered. "God's mercy is greater than our failures." After filling the grave, Gianna returned to the cabin. In a cedar chest that had survived the fire, she found papers Daniel had kept safe. His army discharge papers marked with an honorable release date, his baptism record from a mission church, and their marriage certificate with Reverend Cutter's careful signature. Each document told its own story of Daniel's quiet dignity. She rolled the papers carefully in oilcloth and tucked them into her saddlebag. Daniel's old mule, Jenny, had wandered back during the night. The faithful creature stood steady as Gianna mounted, adjusting her skirts for the long ride ahead. The trail to Bitterroot wound down through stands of pine and across meadows touched by early spring. Gianna's heart beat faster as the town came into view. People stopped to stare as she rode down the muddy main street, her back straight despite her travel-stained dress. Martha Cutter opened the parsonage door before Gianna could knock. "Child," she breathed, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "We heard about the fire. Come in, come in." Inside, Reverend Cutter paced by the window, his face drawn with worry. "Miss Gianna, Mrs. Red," he corrected himself. "I'm so sorry. This burden weighs heavy on my conscience. I should have spoken against Price's schemes weeks ago." "Then help me speak now," Gianna said quietly. "Let me tell the truth before the congregation tomorrow." The preacher's hands trembled as he gripped his Bible. "The railmen. They've threatened my position. The town council." He swallowed hard. "But yes, you shall speak. God forgive my cowardice." Martha brought soup and fresh bread, clucking over Gianna's tired face. They talked late into the evening, planning tomorrow's testimony. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming on the roof like heaven's own tears. Each drop seemed to whisper of renewal, of courage, of faith that could move mountains. Or perhaps, Gianna prayed, move hearts. She lay awake in the Cutter's spare room, listening to the rain and holding Daniel's mother's beaded necklace that she'd found in the chest. Tomorrow, she would stand before those who had judged them both. Tomorrow she would speak truth to power, no matter the cost. The rain fell steady and clean, washing away the ash and doubt, leaving only determination in its wake. The wooden church creaked under the weight of curious souls that Sunday morning. Townsfolk packed the pews while railroad men lounged near the back, their boots tracking mud on the worn floorboards. Whispers rustled like dry leaves when Gianna entered, her plain dress bearing traces of her journey in its muddy hem. She walked steadily to the front, aware of every eye following her movement. With careful hands, she unfolded Daniel's papers on the pulpit. Her voice, clear as morning light, carried to every corner of the hushed room. "My husband served this country with honor," she began, holding up his discharge papers. "He left the army when conscience wouldn't let him harm innocent people. Since then, he's lived by scripture and honest work." Her fingers traced the marriage certificate as she continued. "He showed mercy to my father, who betrayed him. He built our home with his own hands, prayed every night, and harmed no soul." Reverend Cutter rose from his chair, his hands shaking but his voice firm. "I married them proper, before God and witnesses. These documents speak true." A commotion stirred near the back as Harlan Price pushed forward. "Now see here." Gianna's steady gaze stopped him cold. "This valley don't belong to greed," she declared. "It belongs to God." Her words hung in the air like thunder. Even the children sat still, sensing the weight of the moment. Sheriff Dobbs stood up slowly, removing his hat. "Ain't no cause to hold Daniel Red," he announced. "Not with testimony like this." The iron door of the stockade creaked open behind the courthouse. Daniel emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, his face leaner, but his eyes still bright with quiet strength. Though his clothes were dusty from confinement, he stood tall, scanning the crowd until he found Gianna. "I knew you'd come," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. They met in the middle of the muddy street, embracing without words. The townsfolk who had gathered watched in respectful silence, many lowering their heads in shame at their previous judgments. Harlan Price, seeing the tide turn against him, slipped away to the livery stable. Within the hour, he was seen riding hard toward the territorial line, word of his impending indictment already spreading. That evening, in the warmth of Reverend Cutter's cabin, the preacher handed them a folded deed with trembling hands. "The old schoolhouse is yours," he said. "I'm stepping down from the pulpit. Time to make things right." As dusk painted the window panes purple, Gianna and Daniel sat close by the hearth, speaking softly of tomorrow. The firelight caught the simple pine ring on her finger as Daniel spoke. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Not just for us, but for whoever needs shelter most." Gianna rested her head against his arm, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In the peaceful quiet, no more words were needed. The mountain air grew warmer as spring crept into the Bitterroot Valley. Day by day, Daniel and Gianna worked to rebuild their home on Cold Creek Ridge. What started as a lonely task soon changed when Walt Henderson, the blacksmith who'd once shunned Daniel, rode up with his wagon loaded with tools and lumber. "Reckon we owe you both," he said gruffly, tipping his hat to Gianna. More neighbors followed. Men who had whispered against the bear man now sweated alongside him, hauling salvaged logs and raising new walls. Women who had crossed the street to avoid Gianna now brought baskets of bread and helped her plant a spring garden. Daniel worked tirelessly, his strong hands guiding each beam into place. The new cabin grew larger than before, with extra rooms that would serve as schoolrooms. Gianna watched him stop each morning to pray over the site, and her heart swelled with pride at his unwavering faith. As the last snow melted from the shadows, purple wildflowers dotted the meadow near where Samuel Finch lay buried. Daniel spent one quiet morning crafting a wooden cross, carving the words "Grace Given" with careful strokes. Gianna stood beside him as he set it firmly in the earth, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. In the evenings, while Daniel finished the day's work, Gianna sat at their new table writing letters. Her careful words reached out to the valley's widows and orphans, inviting them to the mountain school. "Here you'll find shelter and learning," she wrote, "and the welcome Christ commands." The responses came slowly at first, then faster. Notes written in shaky hands spoke of hope and gratitude. Several promised to come as soon as the school opened its doors. One peaceful evening, as the sun painted the western peaks gold, Daniel and Gianna sat together on their new porch. Their fingers intertwined as they listened to the distant whistle of the Great Northern Railroad echoing through the valley. The sound no longer carried threat or fear. "The Lord can make peace out of ashes," Daniel whispered, his voice deep with wonder. Gianna nodded, tears gleaming in her eyes as she surveyed their rebuilt home. The fresh-cut lumber glowed in the fading light, and smoke curled gently from the chimney. Inside, primer books and slates waited in neat rows for Sunday's first class. She squeezed Daniel's hand, remembering the long path that had led them here. From the shame of that night in the Bitterroot Saloon to this moment of quiet joy, God's mercy had turned sorrow to blessing. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and promise, and in the distance another train whistled, a reminder that change could bring healing after all. Sunday morning painted the Bitterroot Valley in shades of gold. Dawn's first light caught the fresh-cut timber of Cold Creek Mission School, making the new building glow like burnished honey. Dew sparkled on the wildflowers that Gianna had planted along the path, and morning birds called from the surrounding pines. Daniel stood on the porch, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the yard. He had risen before sunrise to sweep the wooden steps and arrange the benches in neat rows. Now he watched the mountain trail, waiting. The morning air carried a hint of wood smoke from the cook stove, where Gianna prepared fresh bread for their guests. The first wagon appeared just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Little Sarah Miller, age 8, bounced on the seat beside her widowed mother, her dark braids swinging with excitement. Daniel stepped forward to help them down, addressing each by name with gentle dignity. "Welcome, Miss Sarah. Mrs. Miller, we're mighty glad you've come." More families arrived, the Henderson children walking beside their mother's wagon, the Cooper twins riding double on their old pony, 3-year-old Tommy Watson carried in his grandmother's arms. Each time, Daniel greeted them personally, his quiet strength putting even the shyest children at ease. Inside, Gianna touched the small pine box that once held Daniel's carved wedding ring. Now transformed into a bell, its sweet tone rang out across the yard, calling everyone to gather. She had polished it until the wood gleamed, a symbol of how love could reshape the simplest things into something sacred. Sunlight streamed through the new windows, highlighting the careful brushstrokes of scripture on the wall. "Be ye kind one to another." Gianna had painted the words herself, each letter a prayer for the healing they hoped to bring to this mountain community. The children settled onto benches, their eyes wide as they took in the neat rows of primers and slates. Several mothers dabbed at tears, remembering their own school days back east. Even the oldest boys, trying hard to look solemn, couldn't hide their interest in the maps Daniel had drawn, showing the surrounding valleys and peaks. As Gianna opened her Bible to lead the first hymn, movement at the door drew everyone's attention. Reverend Josiah Cutter stood there, his Sunday coat dusty from the trail. He looked different now, humbler, the pride gone from his bearing. Farming had weathered his hands and tanned his face, but peace lived in his eyes. "Room for one more?" he asked softly. Daniel nodded, and the former preacher took a seat near the back. When they began singing Amazing Grace, his deep voice joined the others, carrying the harmony as naturally as ever. The familiar words filled the schoolroom with hope. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The morning passed in a blur of joy. Children recited verses they had practiced at home, their voices growing more confident with each word. Gianna found herself blinking back tears as little Sarah Miller perfectly delivered the 23rd Psalm, her small face glowing with achievement. As afternoon shadows lengthened, families gathered in the yard to share food and fellowship. Candles began to twinkle from the windows, and laughter echoed off the mountainsides. Children played tag between the apple saplings Daniel had planted, while their mothers exchanged recipes and stories on the porch. Daniel stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the scene with quiet wonder. The setting sun painted the peaks in purple and gold, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and promise. Gianna joined him, slipping her hand into his. "The Lord keeps his promises," Daniel said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Even to beasts." Gianna smiled up at him, seeing not the fearsome, bear man of legend, but her husband, gentle, faithful, and beloved by the very community that once shunned him. "There are no beasts here," she whispered, "only God's children coming home." Peace settled over the valley like a blessing. The railroad's distant whistle sounded faint and harmless now, overwhelmed by the sweet voices of children singing hymns in the gathering dusk. Here on Cold Creek Ridge, mercy had done its perfect work, transforming shame into glory and strangers into family. As stars began to appear above the mountains, the school glowed like a lantern of hope. Inside its walls, love had written a new story, one that would be told in the valley for generations to come. The story of how faith, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again had healed not just 2 hearts, but an entire community. The valley lay quiet at last, bathed in the gentle light of redemption. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.